I spoke in the previous film about the presence of God and how the whole point of the Old Testament temple was that it was the place of the presence of God in the midst of his people. But it was also a broken presence, an incomplete presence. And as much as the temple was a symbol of God's presence with his people, it was also a symbol of his separation from them. And at the heart of the Old Testament temple was a place called the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, which symbolized the covenant or the relationship between God and his people and his presence in their midst. And everything else revolved around the Holy of Holies. And the temple was laid out as a series of concentric circles around it. And as you came in each successive circle, coming closer to the Holy of Holies, the place you found yourself would be more special, adorned with more costly and precious stones and materials. A place that fewer people were allowed into, and with more elaborate instructions for what they had to do before they were allowed to enter. Until you came to the very centre, the Holy of Holies itself, into which no one was allowed to come. It was off limits to everyone except for one person on one day every year. The high priest was allowed to enter, but only then after lots of sacrifices, elaborate preparations, and enveloped in a cloud of smoke and incense. Why? Why was the Holy of Holies, why was the presence of God off limits to his people? Well, because God is holy. That word holy, kadosh in Hebrew, comes from a root that means to cut off or to separate. And its primary meaning is to flag up for us the separation between God and us, how different, how much bigger and greater and more wonderful and more awesome and better than us he is. That he is perfect, that he is holy. And anything else that's described as holy in the Old Testament is described as holy in a secondary sense, insofar as it's dedicated to and reflects God. So if we think of the most common way that we use that word, holy, a sort of a moral sense, we are holy in what we do, insofar as our lives and our actions are dedicated to God and reflect his character and his ways. And as soon as I say that, of course, I realize that we are not. We are not holy. We fall so far short of the beauty of God's holiness and character and perfection. And that means that we cannot come into the presence of God on our own. It means that no one is worthy. No one is good enough to enter the Holy of Holies. And that's actually something which in the Bible is underlined in the Old Testament in quite scary and difficult ways. The book of Leviticus, for instance, is mainly instructions about the temple and more generally about life. But there's one story that's terrifying and difficult in chapter 10 of Nadab and Abihu, the two eldest sons of Aaron, Moses' brother and the high priest. And it tells us how they came into the presence of God and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. They were a bit blasé. They didn't really care about the presence of God. We don't know how or in what ways they got it wrong, although there's a suggestion later that they might have been drunk. But that was so serious a thing that God struck them down. They were killed in his presence because you cannot enter the presence of God. Well, at least without God having made a way. Now, I think that we as Christians tend to ignore and brush all of that stuff about the holiness of God and the holiness of God as shown in the temple to one side, because we remember that the temple is no longer there. But more importantly, that before it was destroyed, the curtain, which was the thing that separated the Holy of Holies from everyone else, was torn in two from top to bottom. We're told in the Gospels at the very moment that Jesus died. Jesus' death makes it possible for us to come into the presence of God, for us to enter the Holy of Holies. But I don't think that means that this is not important. And I think we ignore the holiness of God set forth in the temple far too easily and far too quickly. Certainly, if you read the New Testament, it's a weighty and wonderful thing, and it has lots to say, actually, as we'll see in a few weeks' time, about how the temple points us to God and shows us what his presence is all about. And when you read New Testament writers like Paul saying things, for instance, like how we can approach God with freedom and confidence, you can almost sense the breathless excitement and awe in their voice as they write it. That we can come into the presence of God, that you are ushered into the Holy of Holies. And it's not that that's become any less important. It's not that God has become any less holy. It's that Jesus has died. Nothing less, nothing more wonderful than that could get you and I into this place of the presence of God. And yet we are now invited in because of this extraordinary thing that he has done for us. But that should evoke wonder, awe, amazed gratitude and worship in us. And I think all too often it just provokes a shrug of the shoulders. Well, that's nice. I think we as Christians, maybe even particularly we as charismatic Christians, for all our songs and talk of the presence of God and how important that is to us, I think sometimes are too easy, too blasé in our expectations of what that means. It doesn't actually matter enough to us that you and I can enter the presence of a holy God, that we can walk through the curtain into the Holy of Holies. So let me try and illustrate it with perhaps the moment when the presence of another person has meant the most to me. And it was my wedding day, exactly a year tomorrow. And on my wedding day, I stood at the front of church and I saw my bride walked in. And my heart leapt with joy and delight as she came to be with me, and I exulted in her presence. But I didn't take it lightly. I wasn't blasé. I hadn't turned up in my jeans and my t-shirt, glancing at my phone and not really fussed about what was going on. It was a moment of intimacy and presence that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Now imagine that and add more to it, because it's a pale reflection of what we're talking about when we think of the presence of God. Put that together with maybe an invitation to meet your hero, or to spend time hanging out with the Queen over tea at Buckingham Palace. Bundle everything you can imagine about how amazing it can be to spend time with another person, and then magnify it, and you'll still be short of how wonderful and amazing it is to be invited into the presence of a holy and perfect and wonderful God. So the temple teaches us not just of the presence of God, but the holiness of God. And so as I finish this film, I want to ask you to meditate on that, to spend some time thinking about the greatness and the glory and the holiness of God. And then spend a little bit of time remembering your own unworthiness, calling to mind sins or patterns of sin that you know make you flawed and unworthy to come into God's presence, and repent of them. But then allow the fresh realization of God's forgiveness and God's welcoming of you into his Holy of Holies to wash over you. Amen.